Okay, welcome back again to the poorly lit studio, which is slightly better lit because I've taken a light bulb from downstairs and brought it upstairs, so we've actually got a bit more illumination for today's wonderful video in which you'll be seeing a 50-something-year-old guy using a pen. Oh my god, isn't that just like, it's almost like going back to the last century, isn't it? Apart from the fact you're watching this via the internet, and therefore it is totally 21st century in every possible way. So there is an issue I'd like to be able to address here. Obviously this is kind of like a demonstration series kind of thing on the subject which I call Transcendental Deism. Okay, and I'm trying to separate my attitude towards matters of the spiritual from that of dogmatic pagan magic through essentially using this one particular term. Nothing against dogmatic pagan magic. If that's where you are at the moment, feel free to watch and enjoy and comment and tell me what a terrible person you think I am at the end of the video. But today I want to think about what actually is spellcraft, which is spoken of by a lot of people in a lot of different ways, and can get rather confusing and difficult for people because essentially there's rather a lot of confusing and difficult things which is spoken about it. Now, way back during my days of pagan education, I was taught a few wonderful things about magic. I was told, of course, ad nauseum, it works, but I was also told how to do spells, and how I was told to do spells was in this manner, with this one particular glib phrase: as you feel. Now, this is something I struggle with quite a lot, and in fact I don't think it's necessarily appropriate for one to be able to communicate about anything that way. Remembering, of course, that the phrase "it works" does, of course, imply a particular specific variety of a result, being, of course, specific, time-bound, measurable, reliable, and repeatable. The word "it" in this one particular case is often applied to the subject of spellcraft, and the idea of works suggests a particular variety of a result, which in most cases doesn't seem to manifest itself. So I often think the term "it works" is wrong. But if it works, and the method is as you feel, wouldn't that open up a bit of a can of worms? Yet another can of worms. I'll see if I can draw a very badly drawn can of worms there. Doodly-doodly-doo. There's your can, and there's worms coming out of it. Okay, can of worms. Because what does that actually mean? Let's take the example of something in the physical world. Cake baking. Now, with cake baking, you need to have specific ingredients. You need to mix them in the right way. You need to have one bowl for your wet ingredients, one bowl for your dry ingredients. You have to follow the recipe, the instructions of mixing the wet ingredients properly and the dry ingredients properly. You have to combine them in the right way, so you have to follow a plan designed to use natural effects, natural forces we could say, appropriately. Alright, you've also got to use the right temperature of oven, and you've also got to have an instrument to measure time so that you can bake the cake for the right period of time. The temperature in the oven has to be reached. You have to preheat, which suggests also that there is preparation that has to be done even before you do anything else. And once you follow this properly, you've used the right tools or the right tin, which has been treated right through greasing, with the right food safe grease, don't even know if I spelled that correctly. I probably spelled that incorrectly, never mind. But you get the message, whether it's with butter or with lard or with oil, in accordance with what the recipe is. Then you've actually got to go through the process of baking. You probably have to observe it for a while. Then you've got to take a knife and you've got to test it to make sure the inside of the cake is done properly, and then assess whether you need to add more time or whether in fact the cake is actually done. Alright? And that is so that you can develop a result which is aesthetically pleasing and culinary appropriate, edible, okay, and enjoyable. And there are plenty of different variables here. Now, with cake baking, you're taking something which is made of ingredients and you're trying to turn it into something which is consumable in a certain particular way and is suitable for you to take to a dinner or to give to someone as a gift. So it's got to actually be nice. It's got to fulfill the task at hand. Now, when it comes to the very idea that you could do anything, whoops, if I can just get this piece of paper away from another piece of paper. Do I have sufficient dexterous skill to be able to do so? Apparently I do not. Oh, there we go. Alright. So that's what it means to essentially bake a cake. Something physical, something tangible, something which has a very specific, reliable result. Okay? Now, even with cake baking, you can occasionally get things wrong. Maybe you're not paying attention, you get the timing slightly wrong, you don't test it properly at the right time to see whether it needs more time or less time. Maybe you add a bit too much flour or a bit too much milk or eggs or whatever it is, and therefore there will be some variability. You might even be buying a different size of egg or a different type of egg, so therefore that might affect the overall result. And then of course there's seasoning it with herbs and spices and all that other kind of fun stuff, which will also affect the result. So therefore, even in something which is quite as prescribed as cake baking, there's a certain degree of variability that affects the results. Okay, that's a simple thing which most people can understand. Most people, even if you've never baked a cake before, you can probably understand what I'm talking about here, that there's certain things you have to do in a particular order in order to get a particular reliable result the vast majority of the time, and even then you may not get it perfectly right, so there's just always a certain level of anxiety when you're doing cake baking, isn't there? Yes, of course there is. But putting that aside for the moment, alright, when we're going back to the subject of spell casting, can we apply the same kind of ideas to cake baking? Kind of, yes, I suppose, because we are supposed to be, hypothetically, dealing with natural forces, focused in a particular way or somehow defined in a particular way. And delivered in a particular way. To develop what one would hope or one would aspire would be a result. So the question remains then precisely, what are those natural forces specific to type of thing you're doing? How are they specifically defined? Then we'd have to go into very deep and detailed analysis as to the specifics of that, taking into account the variety of apparent operation that you're attempting to do. Then you'd have to think about delivery, or in the case of more divinatory or mediumship type stuff, reception, and in what way that should actually be, so that you can then move towards aspiring to say that you've got a result and that you are somehow part of the results. Because if you're talking about spell casting, you are making an assessment, and there's a belief coming on out here that you are a component in a machine. And therefore, you are the one who made it happen. And therefore, you have power. Right, so taking that into account, there must be rather a lot of things that must be studied in terms of what the natural forces are, taking into account the type of operation that you're doing, what particular definition these forces are, how are they used, how you personally interact with them, what is the method of doing so. The how part of this raises a lot of questions. Okay. Forgive my bad writing, I just can't write well, okay? What is the specific method of delivery to achieve the goal? And then you've also got to take into account the possibility that the goal might happen as a result of things outside of what you've done. Okay? So as if it was by chance. Right? There's always a possibility that you didn't actually do anything, or whatever happened in the outer world, it happened purely by chance. Alright? I mean, I've seen some videos of people who say that they've done magic and it worked because they, I don't know, urinated in a jar with a photograph of someone in it, and then a couple of weeks later they lost their job and everything was terrible for them. And it was obviously because that stupid young lady decided to urinate in a jar. When it's more likely that the guy was going through some variety of slow and steady mental decline or a physical health problem that was affecting his performance, and he started treating her badly, and so she wanted to curse him, and her cursing him is more of a symptom of him going through a mental decline, rather than necessarily her cursing him being the thing which actually made him lose his job. You know, you got to think about these things with a certain quantity of nuance, and not just blow up your ego and assume that it's all literally just you and you alone who has the power to control the entire universe. So, going back to the cake baking analogy, alright, thinking it through. Could you bake a cake from the attitude of as you feel? I mean, you know, just like going down the road, picking up a handful of gravel from someone's drive, yeah, that'll be an ingredient. Picking some flowers from the next door's garden, just going in there, stealing the flowers, yeah, that'll be fine, what the hell. A bit of mud, a bit of compost, who gives a heck, you know. Throw in some extra strong mints, because that might make it nicer anyway, and just shove it all together. Don't pay any attention to the temperature of the oven. It's just as you feel, it's just as you feel, it's just as you feel. No. No. If you tried eating cakes made that way, you would get very ill very quickly and would probably die. So, no, you certainly can't bake a cake with the attitude of as you feel. So, if you can't bake a cake with that kind of attitude, how do you think that you can cast spells with the same kind of attitude of as you feel, as well as making the claim that your spell casting, in inverted commas, works? No, you cannot. There is nothing intellectually, rationally, moral or spiritual about this. Also, I'd have to point out that there are some parts of the religious and pagan community which thinks that this phrase of as you feel should be applied morally and socially as well as spiritually when acting in a magical situation. That's a subject for another day, to be quite honest. but it's also something which is equally as egregious. So essentially, instead of thinking about things in terms of it works, or thinking about things in terms of it's as you feel, we'll have to try and work out what the process of learning about spellcasting could actually be, so that you could then start to, build up some possible experiences at some point in the future, which might serve to inform you somehow spiritually. So therefore, instead of taking this top-down approach, down thinking, of starting from the premise that it works, you start with a bottom-up thinking. Which is, I don't know, but I can experiment. And then learn from subsequent experiences. So therefore, the thinking is not, it works. No, it's not, it works. But it's a question of the process of experimentation to gain understanding. So therefore, from my point of view, the claim is not that of power, not something to be afraid of, and not something that's going to provide you with a lover or tons of money or health or property or a job or anything like that. It's more to do with experimentation, experiences, and building understanding combined with broad reading around the subjects. And then from your combined experiences and your broad reading around the subject, to try and build hypothetical models of spiritual reality. And then if you do that, using bottom-up thinking rather than top-down thinking, you're progressing in terms of the search for the truth. And remember, the search for the truth doesn't actually mean to say you'll ever 100% find it. Alright, so truth is elusive. And that should be like a catchphrase for every, as it were, if you forgive me using the no truth true Scotsman logical fallacy, every true magician, so to speak. Not the use of the phrase "it works," not the use of the phrase "it's as you feel," because that doesn't make any sense from any intellectual point of view, taking into account that the belief about magic is about trying to affect or influence the outer world, and therefore we have to start to try and think about these things from a scientific point of view and start to build up some building blocks of understanding of the preparation of the operator, which is of course you, and therefore the search for different types of experience over time. Maybe after a period of time of doing your bottom-up thinking, going through the search for the truth, knowing that truth is elusive, you'll be able to get some experiences together which at various different times in your life will provide you with the ability to periodically do something. Now, personal experience with mucking around with this subject since God was a boy has shown me that under various different conditions in your life, in various different times of your life, you're going to be able to do some things more easily and other times do other things more easily, just like with any other skill. Alright, if you go through, let's say you spend once a week you go to a knitting class or something and you do knitting every single week for about a year. After the year you're then very good at knitting. If you then stop it for about a period of 10 years, you'll probably really struggle to get the skills together again to be able to knit yourself a woolly hat. So all skills are variable and are based upon, to a certain extent, your training and the way you've developed at the time. So skill varies over time with your ability, with your training. And how it affects you. Alright, so that's just something else to be aware of. So as far as like the ingredients are concerned for the cake, whoops, that's the wrong piece of paper. You know, the ingredients for the cake, part of that will be how you're training yourself at that time to attempt to try and achieve something. Okay, so if we're going to try and move away from the use of the phrase, it works, and we're going to try and cross that out and make sure we don't use it because it doesn't seem to be descriptive of the nature of the phenomena that we're talking about, because as I've already mentioned in my previous slide, not really previous slide, it's a previous piece of A4 paper, right? Skill varies over time, you know, with your training, okay, and with, you know, what you're doing with your mind, because what appears to be apparent on the basis of experience is that all magic is essentially the mind and body of the practitioner interacting with spiritual experience. Okay, the mind and body interacting with spiritual experience, which means that in different forms of training will lead to different experiences. And also your personal spiritual evolution, of which there is none higher than the other. It's just how you are as a person at the time when it comes to spiritual experience will also affect the result. So spiritual experience, I should call it. Development. Affects results. Which also means, yet again, that you've got more variables, which means that a clear-cut 100% reliable effect, and therefore being able to say it works, would in fact be the wrong use of language for such a complicated and nuanced subject. Therefore, all magic is essentially the product of growing with various different disciplines. Okay, so although there's similarities in varieties of training for different apparent results, such as mediumship, spiritual healing, circle casting, psychometry, and all of these other different forms of denomination of perception about, attempting to do the world of the weird in some conscious and controlled manner, the apparent results and experiences you get is the product of growing with different disciplines, and how those disciplines and theologies affect you as a person. Which means, of course, there is a human component, namely you as an individual, which is also going to create another variable, a confounding variable, which again means it's almost impossible to say that there's any result which is specific, time-bound, measurable, reliable, and repeatable. Thereby, again, the phrase "it works" is in fact not only factually inaccurate, but also thoroughly misleading. So therefore, we should be saying all magic is essentially a process of gaining, let's just move this up here a bit, different varieties of spiritual experience to investigate nature. Okay, now in using the word nature here, we're talking about everything. Alright, there's, let's say that this circle here represents nature. Alright. Now that's the whole of social nature, psychological nature, spiritual nature, physical nature, Newton's laws of motion, quantum physics, quantum entanglement, the action of your kettle boiling water in the morning for your coffee. That is absolutely everything in nature. Humanity has discovered a certain proportion of that right now. But whatever nature is, and all the things in it, remains 100% absolute. Okay, no matter what, every single time at standard temperature and pressure, pure water of a certain type will boil at 100 degrees Celsius. There are some things which are 100% absolute and reliable, including the laws of gravity and God alone knows what else. Absolutely everything is the way it is. But humanity only understands this quantity here, and science itself is actually quite a young discipline. It hasn't been around for that many centuries in the current form of experimental understanding. Sure, we've gone through various different periods in history, such as the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, I've written that badly, but never mind. Renaissance, Enlightenment, development of silicon chips, and all the rest of that which has led up to today. So that would suggest that science is somehow an important thing, because it has shown us that there are new ways in which we can look at life, look at this art, and also look at technology for the purposes of enhancing human experience and human ability, and to assist in building great economies and all that kind of other fun stuff. But I think it's this period here which is the one that we should be focusing our attention on, because the Enlightenment was all about what type of thinking should we be doing. Yes, there was obviously some negative periods, well, some negative things about the Enlightenment, because it created a lot of physical reductionism. And gave a physical reductionist interpretation of how we should break down the universe, which to a certain extent, other things such as the Romantic period, which came after the Enlightenment, And of course, from an architectural and artistic point of view, there was also something called the arts and crafts movements. Then there was a movement religiously towards just something called transcendentalism in America, which is a different using of the word that I'm using it for when I'm talking about transcendental deism, but it still refers to a form of spirituality whereby the individual recognizes the divine merit of the other human individual. All of these things were kind of like not really an attack on, but essentially providing another point of view to kind of like soften the blow of the physical reductionism which occurred as a result of the Enlightenment movement. But I don't see why we shouldn't try and find ways of attempting to use more scientific thought, not necessarily based upon physical reductionism, but inspired by the physical sciences, to the world of the spiritual. Now we've gone through the Romantic period, the arts and crafts movement, the Transcendentalist movement. Give me a minute. Give me a minute. Okay, so as I was saying before I was so wonderfully and rudely interrupted by a client, we've been through various periods in history: Renaissance, Enlightenment, Romantic period, arts and crafts, and Transcendentalist movement. And strangely enough, all of these things have, to a certain extent, contributed to the development of paganism from 1953 onwards, Gerald Gardner and all the rest of that. You know some of the story. So I think we can say that paganism is not a bad thing, but it does tend to focus on the Romantic period, the arts and crafts movement, the Transcendentalist movement, and as a culture, it kind of moves away from Renaissance and Enlightenment-based thought. Now, that's good, that's pastoral, that's quite beautiful, and it shows that the pagan movement is serving a very particular powerful emotional purpose. All right, we can say that's, you know, pastoral, pretty, and also mythic. Okay, these are good things. But if we start to move away from at least thinking about some of the thinking which occurred in other periods in history and how they have enabled us to have the technology whereby I can talk to you through a box of lights on your table, then I think we're missing out on a treat. Now, with the combination between the more intuitive and the more scientific together, we should be able to, as a result of, for want of a better phrase, magical experience, build up a bigger picture as to what nature could actually be about. So denying this is not a good thing. So we still have to think things through, because if we're going to, going back to my previous paper slide, alright, if we're going to do something basic like cake baking, we need to have an understanding of weights and measures. Alright, we have to think about things in terms of the right ingredients, it's food safe, it's fresh, it's good for you, it's going to do its job, and it's going to chemically work within the baking tin, within the environment of the oven, to create your aesthetically pleasing, edible and enjoyable experience of the cake. So therefore, the Enlightenment thought is to a certain extent used in a bit of homespun wisdom for the purposes of cake baking. So why not use Enlightenment thinking associated with magical or psychic experience to try and find ways of understanding nature better? Alright, whether you're using pagan and pastoral, pretty and mythical ideas as your bit of irrationality to get there. Okay? Now, I've spoken previously in previous little sort of, these aren't really lectures, this is Nick talking with a pen, okay? It's not really a lecture. But my previous thing here about the use of the irrational applied essentially with reason to help to achieve a experience. And I drew one circle here and one circle there, and I says that this is essentially religion, and this is essentially nature, and this somehow points to whatever is happening in this. It's spiritual nature or psychic experience, spiritual experience. But the problem was that the map is not the territory. And my interpretation of transcendental deism is to be concerned more with spiritual experience as an expression of nature than it is with religion. Okay? So that's essentially me, that's where I'm coming from. Transcendental deism, not religion. I'm not essentially a pagan. I do not identify as a pagan. I don't identify as a Christian either. I identify as a transcendental deist because I'm trying to use reason and experience to analyze through a few irrational or animistic concepts basically what could be happening here for the purposes of searching for something which is impossible, of course, which is the magic that works. Or indeed finding some way of aligning myself with this bit somehow so that I can operate in it. I mean, if there is life after death, I'm going to spend a lot more time here than I ever spend here or in the physical world, so therefore this does have some kind of importance, hypothetically. But that's just a point of view. That's not necessarily reality. There's too many things that in reality we don't know. Which is, of course, why we cannot say with any certainty or with any intelligence whatsoever that it works. Okay? So then it's a question of what cogwheels in a machine, when it comes to spell casting, should we be putting into effect? And this is where it gets complicated, because the ways in which people have described this all across the world, throughout the whole of time and space, is very, very different. And most of the sources that we go to are in fact primarily religious. They are not specifically scientific when it comes to trying to find out what is true in the universe from a spiritual point of view. So that's where we come across a massive great problem, because we're being sold religion and not anything that's like sufficiently clear-minded and appropriate enough for us to be able to get our teeth into. Now, if I can find it, I probably will not be able to because my room is a complete tip. I previously showed you a slide made of paper of 4 meditations because I had to try and work it out for myself. What the different types of training should be in order to potentially be able to hypothetically at least experience some of this stuff, not necessarily control it. And I broke it down into these 4 things. Mindfulness, which is a place where you get the ability to have some basic visual experiences, which I call your visual display unit. The body scan, which provides some variety of laminar flow to the mind, helping you to think with one thought. Then chakra meditations, which opens you up to something. And you can start getting some weird experiences just by going as far as that in your training. And then finally, ascension, which leads you directly into the spiritual world, or at least seems to. And that's why Aleister Crowley was quite so aggressive when he spoke about the use of this one particular technique, which he described in one particular way in his book, Magic in Theory and Practice, of which I've got a copy lurking around somewhere, as being something you should be doing every single day. However, fitting that into 21st century life is really difficult. In fact, fitting a lot of this into 21st century life is really difficult. So therefore, we're always going to struggle. But going through this process appears to be, from experiential point of view, the way of bringing yourself to the point of having some of the basic experiences eventually, which could lead you on to, doing stuff, potentially. So essentially that's the kind of training which I think that you should be going through if you wanted to develop magically in one way or another. Now, the components here appear to be this. Remember, I described this as like, you know, if there's a machine there, it's going to have lots of little cogwheels in it, and they're all going to interact, and there's going to be like a, you know, a spring or something, and eventually you put a force in, you get a result out. But you've got to understand where all the cogwheels go and what size they are and what magnitude and power they are, and put them together in the right sequence in order to get an apparent result. Okay? Now, it's pretty much impossible to be able to explain each and every single component, because there's so many different things which could go into various different things that we're in a position of thinking, I don't know, it could be complicated, and so on and so forth. But we can try and have a look at some of the various different components which people have put together in various different orders and see whether it could possibly yield some variety of experience. Firstly, circle casting. Is that essential? Well, Chaos Magicians would say no. Chaos Magicians would say that circle casting is a form of centering, a form of bringing yourself into yourself. But personal experience on my side of things suggests that the circle actually has some variety of objective existence. I have, for instance, felt the boundary of the circle with the back of my hand and felt it giving, almost as if it's like a membrane made of static electricity. I have, in some ceremonies, seen the circle of blue light being on the ground where the circle was cast. So maybe there is a hypothetical possibility that the circle does have objective existence. If that is the case, what is its function? Well, experience seems to suggest that as you cast it and you seal it, you draw it with your, your pentagrams or your candles or in any tradition that's comfortable to yourself, and then you seal it through visualizing, the circle being closed with your finger being your magical wand, or indeed your magical wand if you're that way inclined. When the circle is closed, it feels like the psychological noise around me is being slowly turned down until it's quiet. Very, very quiet. The energy of my experience therefore changes, and it's almost like the circle itself doesn't just become a working space, or whatever you want to call it. There's an actual thing there, meaning there is a barrier. And it feels to me when I do this thing, and I feel this nearly every time I do it. I say nearly because it's not always consistent, to be a real thing. So what does that do? If that does quieten down psychological interference, then that reduces psychic interference. So if that reduces psychic interference, the circle itself becomes a place which is ideal for meditation, contemplation, and also more concentration, and one of the words which pagans hate using but would be reasonably accurate, a place of worship. When you're casting a circle, you're not creating a working space. You're essentially making for yourself a temple or a church. Specifically for whatever it is that you believe you can engage with. Now, some hypotheses of engaging with higher entities suggest that higher entities such as angels and spirits and gods and the rest of that, and of course goddesses, alright, they find the physical world difficult, as we all do, okay? Alright, so maybe, hypothetically, the circle is useful when dealing with mediumship and contacting angels and gods. Just because it feels calmer, sorry, got a cold, more insulated, safer, and more spiritual. Now, there's plenty of debate as to whether you need to use various ritual things such as candlelight and salt and incense and water and the rest of it, but those things are more religious rather than necessarily spiritual, rather than necessarily factual, rather than necessarily something which actually matters. Some of the best and most efficient circles I've cast was with no ritual tools at all, and just drawing the pentagrams and invoking the elements and that sort of thing. So, ritual tools aren't essential. But things that enhance the psychology can be useful. Okay, many spiritual mediums would tend to do their work by candlelight because it's a lower type of light. There's no blue light in the candlelight, it's a yellowish light. So therefore, it's not bringing your brain into the wakefulness state, it's encouraging some of the hormone of sleep, it's a more relaxing environment, and it's more appropriate for forms of spiritual work. So therefore, that might increase your ability to be able to open up spiritually when you're doing things like the chakra meditations on the other piece of paper which I showed you a little while ago, such as the chakra meditations going red, orange, yellow, green, blue, purple, brilliant, white in sequence in one form or another. Now that can be done before or after you do your circle casting. I don't think it necessarily matters. You'll have different experiences one way or the other. You might want to do it before and afterwards, depending upon how open up you want to be to various different things. Now, just doing that just once won't get you there. Practicing with it will be more likely to get you there, okay? And also different states of wellness and illness will also have an effect upon your permeability to spiritual things, or so it seems. But yes, you can use candles, you can do it in the ceremonial way. That could possibly help you out, and it will make you feel more proper, so to speak, when you're doing it. So circle casting could be a hypothetical component in the machine. Not necessarily necessary, but maybe if you increase the probability that you enter into the right state of mind, you're likely to have put that extra component into the machine. Then people talk about intention. Now I've broken these things down into intention, awareness, perception, attention. Alright, but there's also what is typically called energy raising. Which essentially is quite curious. Now, your intention, one would assume, if you're doing something magical for the purposes of creating a result, would have to be quite precise. Your awareness would have to be based upon what you're trying to do. Is it for divination? In which case your target would have to be precise. But the awareness is not focused in the same way. It is more open, receptive, and people would use meditative language trying to describe the state as in outward. Thinking outwardly rather than focusing on one particular thing. Then it's a question of what precisely are you supposed to be perceiving, and how much attention is required. Okay, so there's a difference when you're thinking about divination, which is open and receptive. You got to change your perception, and you got to have your attention in a certain particular direction. Your intention is precise whether you're doing divination or whether you're doing something to affect the outer world. Energy raising comes from activity, usually repetitive, okay, so energy raising. This is for spell casting, not divination. Or should I say energy delivery. Okay, the delivery of energy. We're not talking about something here that works, but that energy can be delivered. Okay, and energy raising is, as I said, repetitive, so that could be chanting, drumming, lengthy prayers, and so on and so forth. Which would of course be what you're most comfortable with when it comes to, you know, whatever culture or background you're a part of. Whether it's more Christian, whether it's more pagan, whether it's more Druidic or Wiccan or whatever it is you're talking about. But essentially, we're still talking about the same process here in order to try and raise energy, make energy work, sense energy, and so on and so forth, cross cultures. All right, this is not Wicca, this is not paganism, this is not ceremonial magic, this is all of them put together. And this is the same essentially rules and understandings which I think that we all need to have when doing any of these things. After a period of time, which could be like 10 minutes or more, the energy then gets delivered. Alright, now the delivery of the energy can be through making a wish, or doing some form of symbolic gesture at the same time. As the mind sends intention. Now, the delivery of energy could just be outward, just sending it out into the universe, bam. It could be delivered to an object, Now, whether the object itself is actually part of the process, or whether the object itself is merely a symbol for the delivery of the energy, remains up to debate and discussion. But either way, some would say that the energy that was raised over here then gets delivered via the object itself to the target, which would be a person, place, situation, or whatever. And thus, you would have your very precise intention delivered through a process which will involve your energy raising, and it will go out to your target. Alright? I don't believe that there is any real spiritual danger to any of this stuff whatsoever. The main danger of any form of magic and occultism and witchcraft is the way in which you think. Alright, so it's primarily dangers are cognitive and perceptual. Namely, how your personal experiences of all these things affect you as a human individual, and what it is you end up saying and doing. And you've got to make sure that you're not being too abnormal, otherwise you end up being kicked out of human society, don't you? You end up being essentially insane, as I was about 30 years ago. Alright? So that's your principal danger. You always have to be therefore on a good quality personal and self-developmental path of some description or other. Personal and self-developmental lifestyle. And you've also got to be doing things which ground you in normality. Alright, as well as having, ideally, a healthy lifestyle. Now, what's going to happen is if you go through this process of essentially doing this magical stuff, this weird and wonderful magical stuff, working with your intention, attention, awareness, perception, and your energy raising and your spell casting and the rest of it, and you've gone through the process of doing your 4 meditations of mindfulness, body scan, chakras, and ascension, you can have some weird and wonderful things which can actually occur. Alright? If you experiment with things like invocation, you can start to develop very strong theologies. So invocations can create strong belief, and those theologies, or whatever you want to call them, can distract you from normal, safe living. I might do a video purely about invocations at some point or another, because I've done a fair few, some of which are demonstrated here on my YouTube channel in a very basic way, but never mind. Okay, so taking that into account, you have to have a good understanding of what it means to be a safe, healthy individual living life. So therefore there's about 11 things in life you need to carry on caring for, and that is your health, money, work, family, image, appearance, reputation, property, presence of mind, skill development for life, and personal safety. Physical safety, physical and psychological. Okay, those are the 11 things that matter when it comes to your basic day-to-day survival. And these are things which you've got to carry on working on in order to try and make sure you stay safe and you don't allow the ideas which you come across as a result of experimenting with magic and occultism and witchcraft and all the rest of that fun stuff to distract you away from this basic structure of what it means to be a surviving human being. These 11 things are what it means for you to maintain your physical ability to stay alive. Alright, so you don't want to compromise them for any reason whatsoever. So there you go. That's some very basic understanding of the theories of spellcasting and a little bit about divination, and I'll try and go into these in more detail in subsequent videos at some point in this semi-lecture format which I happen to be doing at this present point in time in my own personal development. And I'll speak to you in a little while. By all means, there's a search facility somewhere on this channel. You can use that to search for all kinds of World of the Weird type stuff. And if you feel like spending a bit of money, I would recommend you go onto lulu.com and get yourself a book called The Grimoire and the Herbal, in which I'll go into this stuff in a different and more interesting way for yourself. Thank you. Bye for now.